Hey guys, how's it going? This is Ryan back with another video, and today I'm going to be coming back to the Cubase stuff. I haven't done this for a while, so today specifically we're going to be looking at how to mix a kick drum essentially. So there's going to be some things in this video which I'm not going to go too in depth with, such as I've got a side chain here. I might do a separate video on that, but this is going to be essentially just the key things to factor in when mixing in a kick drum. Now, what I will say before we get started is every mix is different depending on the genre, depending on the feel, the vibe, the atmosphere, whatever it might be. Um, so I'll do my best to obviously explain as best I can with how I've mixed this. So as you can see, I've already done a very basic mix on a kick drum. I'm not going to go too in depth and add a load more stuff, but you might want to add some potential distortion to this. Sometimes you can go in and add things like gates and stuff, depending on if you're using samples or if you're using raw drums, like you might be. And also, for example, if you're using Cubase in the dynamics field, you can also add things like razors, the squasher, VST, expander, envelope shapers, those sort of things. For simplicity and just as like a starting point, I'm not going to go too in depth with that in this video. So the first thing I like to do, assuming that you don't need a gate, if you do, put that on, is I like to EQ essentially, first of all, just to get that kind of rough frequency saturation, basically, that suits the kick drum. So I always, not, well, I say always, 99% of the time, I like to dip off this first kind of section here, and I usually kind of project somewhere between 50 and 100 on a usual kind of kick drum recording. The reason for this is where the real low end punch is, and obviously, well, the way I mix myself is like I like to have the kick drum be like the low end, like that really pounds through the mix. And I'll show you what that looks like in relation to the bass in a moment. And after that, I like to dip it so it leaves room for like the low end of the snare, for example, so it allows that snare to really pop through. The low end of the snare, essentially, like if you boost that, it comes at like more of a thud, and it really does cut through the mix a lot easier. Once more, obviously, a lot more of this kind of mid to high range, I like to duck out, and then as we get towards the end. In this instance, I have actually used a preset for this and played around with it. I do sometimes boost the top end just slightly, just to kind of have that presence on the high end. I haven't done that in this example, purely because of the style I'm going for. If this was more of a rock song, I would probably boost the top 5k just a little bit, depending on what the actual sample sounds like. So that's the EQ. We then move over to multiband compression. To be honest with you, using a multiband compressor or just using a standard compressor doesn't matter overly much. I think if you know what you're doing, I think it's always better to use a multiband, because you do have a little bit more control over the frequencies and what you're compressing, in terms of the low end, the high end of each kind of audio file. So in this instance, let's just have a quick look at this. So you can see here, ratio wise, the low end and the high end, I haven't put a lot of ratio on. There's nothing stupidly low, apart from potentially this top end I might have compressed a little bit. Yeah, you don't want to compress something too much, and the reason why I say that with drums, the more you compress something is, you lose that low end a lot of the time. It brings up the frequencies to more of a mid kind of range. Yeah, it just doesn't sound too good, which if you've mixed the bass or you've mixed the kick drum before, and you've put a lot of heavy compression on it, you'll know what it sounds like. It sounds a bit tinny and a little bit one-banded. So and lastly, two more things on here, and then I'll give you an example of what it sounds like in the mix and on its own. I've added a further EQ, and as I discussed earlier, you can see I've just boosted that top end a little bit, and once again refocused on this kind of low end boom kind of sound, whilst cutting off that initial drop. A little bit of dip here where the snare comes in. Once again, just cut off that low end a little bit more on the actual master track EQ. The reason for this is just because it can sound a little bit too boomy, or like, I don't know how the terminology for it. It can sound a little bit too boomy, is what I'm getting at. Like, you want that real clear, concise bass drum pounding, whereas those frequencies, you can't pick them up on a lot of speakers, so it does sound really messy if you boost that for a mix. Just sounds like flat noise, basically. Lastly, we've got the reverb, which in this instance I'm using RAWM, which I believe is, Native Instrument. There we go. It's a Native Instrument plugin. It's reverb. It just adds a little bit of kind of echo on the end of it, or reverb being the proper terminology. Yeah, they're the 4 plugins that I use a little bit. I wouldn't always put reverb on my bass drum, but the reason why I have on this instance is because of the atmosphere in the mix, which you'll hear. But you don't always have to put reverb on it. So let's just have a quick look and listen to this mix in context, just so you can hear. And this will have a side chain as well, so you'll be able to hear like this kind of thing on the bass, kind of ducking in and out. So here we go. Cool. So you can hear there, that's got a real nice kind of deep presence to it. It's like that real kind of dancey kind of vibe. Not too compressed, that you got a lot of that low end there, but it's not something that just sounds like it's not mixed at all, which is kind of what you want to go for. You don't want something to sound raw, but at the same time you don't want it to sound like it's like super buried in the mix sort of thing. Kick drum is the thing that, you know, goes through people's chests when they hear it and stuff, so I'd recommend always mixing with a kick drum coming in with at least a decent amount of presence. If we then go over to here, we'll just pick this bit for example. This is where you're going to hear some snares and some hi-hat, just a little bit more context around the drums rather than just the low end. Now the hi-hat isn't mixed. First of all, let me just display that as literally a compressor on there just to give it a real rough kind of thing. And the snare is very basic mixed as well, so I'm not going to go into that. But you can hear there, the bass drum, you can't really hear it as much when other drum parts are actually going in. That's the kind of thing where, I mean, I'm listening through some earphones at the moment, it probably will sound good on speakers, but you would literally just play the drums and you would adjust the levels, you know, adjust the frequencies on the EQ so that everything kind of fits in nicely. In this instance, if I look at the snare, you can see here there's no low end presence down here. It's literally around this kind of 200 mark, where I've boosted it a little bit and more high end presence on the snare. Yeah, so that's my last thing that I would say about on mixing drums, or particularly a kick drum, is being aware of what the other drums are doing, what the other instruments are doing. So if we go look at the bass, haven't EQ'd this, that's a mistake. In fact, we're going to EQ this live. So what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to dip out where that kind of frequency is, where the kick drum is pounding. Even though the side chain is there, and that is the purpose of the side chain, so it ducks out whenever that frequency is heard. But I'm just going to have a little play around with the EQ while we're on this topic. Cool. So just to talk about what I did there, you'll notice that I didn't start this bump until after the 50 and 100 kind of frequency mark. And I've kind of put it where that initial snare hit would be. I can always sidechain this with the snare if I need to, but to be honest with you, that'll probably be a nice level because that's quite low end, and whereas the snare will cut through quite nicely. So yeah, and then obviously the top end here, because of the buzziness of the bass, it's being a synth bass. I didn't want to have a lot of that high end presence, so that's why I've ducked that one off. But yeah, hopefully this video has kind of helped you guys. Like I said, I haven't gone in depth with the sidechain, but if you want to do a little bit of research into that, feel free. I might actually do a separate video on it at some point soon, to kind of talk about what a sidechain is, how to do it properly, and the uses of actually using it in a mix, and when to use it, and so on and so forth. But for the here and now, thank you for watching, guys. Appreciate your time, and yeah, have a good one. Bye bye. Subscribe.